Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing a reading vlog for my most anticipated release of the year, which would be The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. Many of you know that in general, before I pick up newer works, I avoid seeing other people's thoughts anyway, but with this one, I am especially having to go out of my way to avoid seeing what other people think. If a friend of mine sends me a voice note and they mention The Devils, I just immediately type out, sorry, I can't keep listening. Even though I don't think you're even going into spoilers, I don't even want to have an idea of what you think of it yet. I'll talk to you after I've read it. It makes it sound really selfish. But anytime somebody's thumbnail comes up and The Devils is there, I don't even want to see the expression on their face, whether they look disappointed, whether they look excited and ecstatic about what they just read. I don't want to see any of it. So I've tried really, really, really hard, extra hard to avoid. But there's so many people talking about this. And I just need to finally get into it. Part of why I've been putting it off a little bit is because I'm so excited about this. I want to ensure that, I don't know how else to describe it. Have you ever just wanted to engage in a story that you're excited about, whether it's a TV show or a movie or a book, and you're like, everybody leave me alone. I feel like I need that for this, and I've felt like I've needed that to start this, and at this point, I just need to jump into it. I really just need to set aside the time and get into it, but that's the reason why I haven't picked it up just yet, is because I've just needed to have that feeling of like, everybody leave me alone. So I am officially going to be jumping into this because it is such an anticipated release, and because I know a lot of you are also big fans of Abercrombie. I thought it would be fun to do this in a vlog style where I update you as I'm reading. At the moment, because I haven't actually read it yet, I don't know if I'm gonna really want to talk spoilers or not. If I do talk spoilers, I'll let you know, yes or no, if I'm gonna talk spoilers in editing. And I'll also, when I talk spoilers, if I do, I will ensure there's timestamps. But if I'm able to convey a lot of my thoughts without going into spoilers, then I will try to keep it spoiler free. And then also, my dog, I looked over there because she's over there. We're going to have Luna Bear interludes because she's the best thing about me. Have her pop in from time to time and be cute and precious. And then I'll update you as we read through this. And then at the end, we'll summarize and get into final thoughts. And on that note, let's jump into it.
Bless you. Okay. I'll take you out soon. Okay.
I'm officially 160 pages into The Devils, so I figured I'd sit down and give an update. I have the microphone really close because I have my air conditioning unit on and it's really loud, and I'm hoping that this will fix the problem. But I'm also kind of nervous that all that's going to happen is I'm going to be too close to the microphone and you're going to still hear the AC unit. But it's 110 degrees outside and I don't want to turn it off, so we're just going to power through. It's in theme with the book. This is turning out to be exactly what I was expecting, based off of the synopsis. So when I had read the synopsis when the book was first announced, when I kind of looked at it again a little bit here and there leading up to its release, I was reminded of the fact that it very much seems like it was going to be those moments of cheekiness and the dry humor that we get throughout some of other works by Abercrombie. It was going to be like that, but dialed up, just based off of this sort of merry band of misfits and over-the-top feeling that I got from the synopsis. And that's proven, I think, fairly true so far up through this point, and I have a feeling it's going to continue because that does seem to be the overall tone of the book. I've said before that I can be exceptionally picky when it comes to the balance between serious themes and the sillier things. And I really feel like Age of Madness drilled that home perfectly for me. And additionally, it was impressive because I think he's fantastic at characterization, but I don't necessarily come away from his works feeling like I love anybody. Age of Madness did have a character by the end that I was like, this I can't. This isn't about Age of Madness. But regardless, the point is that I find that his characterization is phenomenal, but I am impressed because I am such a character-driven reader that for not really having a character that I adore, I still consider it to be one of my favorite series of all time. And then with the Devils, it just felt like everybody was going to be well written, like everybody was going to stand out. But because it is an ensemble cast, that we might end up leaning a little bit into almost caricatures. And I would say I feel like that. I wouldn't necessarily at this point, because maybe this will change, and that would be great if it did. But at this point, everybody feels slightly exaggerated. I also find that everybody is sort of representing the weakest versions of ourselves, the most pathetic versions of ourselves, the most vile versions of ourselves. And I think he excels at that because that's part of what I think really attracts us to his characters is they kind of represent the worst of us, but then we kind of can't help but fall in love with them regardless of that. Whereas in this one, though, I don't really feel like there is necessarily the connection. It feels like I'm watching everybody to be entertained as opposed to connect. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It is entertaining. I would actually compare this probably as far as the overall, it's so stupid, it's kind of funny feeling to the show What We Do in the Shadows. And I do find that there is something to the low-hanging fruit jokes, the jokes that we're not even trying to avoid the simplest and most crude of jokes. We're just going to latch onto those and use them. I do find that funny from time to time. I do think, though, that they are too frequent in this. You definitely have to lean in. If you're going to do that, you got to lean in and you got to commit. But I think we have maybe potentially, for my taste, overcommitted because, as an example, you have a character that is a magician and everybody's always like they're a sorcerer, they're a warlock. They always say everything but magician. And this character is always losing their mind over the fact that nobody can get it right. And then you have another character that whenever they're within, even though it's third person, whenever we're following them, there is something in the text that'll say like, well, ask anybody. They were a good thief, or ask anybody and they would tell you, that kind of thing where it's like, okay. And it's a lot of repetition to drill home a point. And when you have repetition in juvenile humor for the sake of just being so dumb, it's funny. And then you have repetition in phrases in order to drill home characterization, it can start to lose its charm. And I actually think if we had been a little bit more sparing with the use of repetition, that it would have worked a little better. And it's not just in the characterization, it's not just in the humor. There is sort of when it almost feels like the narrator is talking to you feeling that it's established as well. So as an example, in the narrative, very, very early on, basically the opening of the book, it's listing all of these people in this crowd and it'll say like, oh, it had these individuals who were sick and it had these individuals who were, and fill in the blank, and it mentions prostitutes and then it lists a bunch of other people and then it mentions prostitutes again and then it lists other people and then it mentions prostitutes again. And then later on in the story, there's a part where it's talking about the things that suck about traveling. And it's like, oh, I'm going to just list stuff off. It'll say something like, oh, it's the weather and it's dealing with all these other people and it smells and the mud. And then it lists a bunch of other things. And then it's like, and the mud and the mud. And it just kind of keeps hitting the same point. And it's like, but we're doing this all the time. So it goes from being clever, because I do think there are times where you can be so profoundly stupid that it's actually clever. It's going from that to just being frequently stupid. And I want to meet it where it is, and I want to appreciate it for what it is. But it's not, I really think at this point, it's not gonna turn around. I think I can see myself just enjoying it for what it is for the rest of the time, but I really don't think it's going to get to be in a place that I would categorize as more than just entertaining. I don't really think it's going to hit home. There are some lines on occasion that are critical of institutions, and that's the part of Abercrombie that I'm like, oh, I want more of this, and then some of the dumb humor. not mostly dumb humor and then sometimes a really great quote. It kind of feels like it's a it's meant to be like quotable and it's meant to be cinematic and it is traveling. And I will say the structure of there being this merry band of misfits that are going on some kind of basically quest, it's really hard for me to like those kinds of stories. As an example, Kings of the Wild, I ended up DNFing that one because it had some similar feelings to it. Ironically, one of my favorite stories of all time also follows some characters on a pilgrimage of sorts, and they are all kind of over the top versions of their character archetypes, and it is one of my favorite stories of all time. So it can be done, certainly. But more often than not, it's a really hard thing for me to find myself getting fully engrossed in. So, to kind of recap, I don't know that the balance between clever and stupid is meeting my personal tastes, and I do think that we're overusing repetition. I don't think I'm going to come away from this really loving any of the characters, even though I think the characterization is present. I just don't really know that I'm going to ever find myself fully connecting with anyone. And I also think that it is not necessarily the kind of plot that tends to grip me in the first place. So it's fine. My thoughts thus far are it is fine.
What? 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 You got nothing to say now?
Having finished The Devils, I have a lot of thoughts, and I actually think that this book can serve as a great jumping off point for conversations about just how much artistry it takes to write humor in a way that genuinely is fresh, original, entertaining, but also can be used alongside other things in the story to tell something that is really meaningful, to be really critical of society, of human behavior, of institutions, of which I think at least my interpretation, I think that was the aim in a lot of The Devils, was a hybrid of all of what I just described. But I do have some criticisms of this book, and I wanted to try to succinctly capture my criticisms before going into the specifics. And the best metaphor I could come up with, because I was trying to think of something that I feel like captured my thoughts, but that everybody else, for the most part, knows what I'm talking about and can very easily be like, I have experienced that. And the metaphor is related to if you've ever been stuck in traffic or you're at a stoplight and somebody in a car nearby has their music all the way up, but additionally they've clearly had their sound system worked on, so the bass is way too loud, it shakes your car, and you feel like your eardrums are going to explode. And sometimes you even realize through all of that you actually know the song and you like the song, but you're like, I don't even care right now. I would rather never listen to that song again. You just pray for the light to turn green or for traffic to clear up because it's so awful, especially when you continuously have to be next to that person as you're driving and you're like, oh my gosh. That's kind of how I felt. In this silly metaphor, I talked about how sometimes you might even like the song. And that's the thing, is I can really get on board with dumb humor. I used the example in the previous section about how the show What We Do in the Shadows is filled with stupid humor. And I actually found that later seasons of that show really dropped off for me when it came to my enjoyment, because I thought they started to rehash the same jokes, and they would revisit those and they would kind of just do another version of the same thing. And then I ended up not enjoying it as much anymore because I liked it when it felt like even the stupidity was clever and original. But once it got into familiar terrain, it's just like, okay, well, I'm kind of bored now. This doesn't feel like there's as much effort put in. It feels a little lazier. It feels almost like fan service to some degree. And in this case, I genuinely can get on board, as I was saying, with the kind of humor that Abercrombie is using in this. But I think it overstayed its welcome. I think it was used too frequently, and I think it was starting to be the same exact jokes over and over and over again. And this is where I wanted to get into the idea of artistry in humor. Because being funny is something that it feels like sometimes is just a part of people, I almost think it can be really difficult to assess what can make something funny, because sometimes it's hard to pinpoint. And when there is a craft behind it, so for example, comedians, I really, really enjoy listening to comedians talk about the craft of writing a joke, its origin, how you go from getting maybe a little laugh from a joke to using that same joke but then getting a bigger laugh just by slightly shifting the wording or your tone or where you're placing it in your set. I think all that is really, really fascinating, and it takes a lot. But because some people just feel naturally funny, I really think it is hard for us to differentiate natural funny from worked on funny. And I think that's actually why sometimes comedians are really funny on stage, but then you listen to them in podcasts or interviews and you think like, oh, I'm surprised that you get up there and you're able to do that, because it's a performance, it's a skill. And so with the Devils, I found that there were a lot of things about the humor that I hope that Abercrombie, I thought genuinely, First Law, Age of Madness, his other works, I already thought they were funny. It feels like we took the things that made those funny and then dialed it all the way up to full volume. And then it also felt like one note, and that took away a little bit. And I hope that, because I think this is something Abercrombie really genuinely likes to weave into his storytelling, I hope that he continues to do this and kind of refine it and figure out exactly his voice. If this is his voice from here on out in his writing, it's not going to work for me, but it will work for other people. I don't think, though, that it's fair for the entire concept of the humor in this story, whether it works for somebody or not, to just say that humor is subjective, because yes, that is certainly true. Humor is subjective, but I don't think boiling it all down to subjectivity is fair to the actual craft of, and that's why I was hitting that point. I don't think it's fair to the craft of storytelling with humor or joke writing or those sorts of things to say it all comes down to it being subjective and from person to person, because there is a lot of skill that is required. So I kind of wanted to break down why I thought it didn't necessarily work. Before I do, I want to make very clear that yes, I think it's fair to say a lot of the humor in this is very juvenile. And a lot of it also is relying on kind of shock factor and vulgarity. I don't necessarily think that just because somebody likes that and just because somebody writes that means that they themselves are juvenile or somehow less than, because we can be kind of gatekeepers when it comes to humor, and we can also judge a lot of people for what they find funny, and I don't really want to engage in that. I think that most people, if you have a character constantly referring to certain parts of their body over and over and over again, I don't necessarily think that just because somebody laughed at that means that, oh, you're just immature. What are you, a child? I really don't like that kind of thought process. So even though I'm going to be kind of critical of this, that's not to say that you are somehow less intelligent. You should like sophisticated humor and only sophisticated humor. So that's not really what I wanted to do, but I wanted to make that very clear because I'm going to be so hard on the humor in this. So the first thing I wanted to note is self-awareness in the humor. I do really appreciate when stories are self-aware. I think that this is very common in things like satirical works, where there is this understanding that even what's transpiring on the page is not necessarily the views held of the person who has created the story. And also there is kind of this wink, wink, nudge, nudge to people consuming the story. Like, we're fully aware that this is absolutely ridiculous. And there will be sometimes the breaking of the fourth wall to talk to you directly. And you'll see Abercrombie does this pretty frequently in the way that third person is utilized in the narrative, but there's a lot of, well, you know how it goes. Like, there's the use of you in it. Doesn't mean that's necessarily always formally breaking the fourth wall, but there is that kind of nudging into that territory where they're sort of inviting you into this almost like inside joke to witness together what's transpiring. So I like self-awareness, and I do think that Abercrombie can sometimes poke fun at his own jokes in his stories, but just because someone is doing that doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to land, and there is skill in when you do this. And I also think sometimes this is going to tie into the repetition factor, but it was used kind of frequently. So an example is there's a character who pretty much has been cursed to never die. So they're constantly accumulating life-ending injuries, but then they come back. And at the end of the story, they're having this kind of showdown with one of the villainous characters. And the villainous characters throughout the story, whenever they go up against a quote-unquote bad guy, they will have somewhat of a villain monologue. And it's kind of really quite corny because it's just every single time they start going on and on about like, well, my mother used these experiments to, and you're just like, why are they saying this right now? Just fight. We've all been critical of the villain monologue. So a lot of the villains have their monologues, and you'll even have showdowns of characters being like, oh, I gotta buy time. And they buy time by getting the enemy to reveal to them just how skilled they are with something. And I want to be clear. It can be done in a way that's fun and that you just kind of like, you're along for the ride. But at the end of the story, with this character that basically is cursed to never die, they're speaking to one of the villains, and the villain says a bunch of stuff before the fight, and they have a line that's essentially like, what, are you not amused, or something like that. And then the character that's cursed to never die says something to the effect of, once you've done this enough times, you've heard it all, it's not really very funny. And it kind of felt like it was acknowledging that not only are we having a villain monologue right now, and there's this kind of like cheeky little, yeah, I'm tired of this, there's that feeling. And part of what makes it funny is it feels like the character himself is representing you, with the fatigue of constantly getting these villain monologues at the ends of or during these action scenes, or sometimes right before the action scenes. It feels like it's representing your fatigue. But I was kind of like, okay, I'd rather just not have the cheesy villain monologue every time. Sure, maybe some people find that funny, but I didn't feel like it was done necessarily to the enhancement of the story because it had been done so many times. Maybe if the first time or the second time. It's like that scene in Indiana Jones when the character is about to fight and they're doing this really cool move and then he just kills him and then it's done with. And it's funny in that moment. But if they did that every time or something where it just kind of, you're like, okay, I get it. I get this. And I've seen this before. That's another really tricky part about, you have to kind of continuously transform humor, because if something's been done before, people are going to feel like, well, I've already seen this. And so that example from Indiana Jones, most people are aware of that. So then when you do it in your work, it's like, oh, I've kind of seen this. And at least in that case, there's like this, oh, I don't want to even do this. I'm done with this. And it's kind of an awareness of the action. We're setting up this big bad, and then we're just like, never mind. And that's kind of shocking and funny. And in this case, it's like, we didn't really interrupt anything. We just sort of acknowledge that we've gotten the villain monologue a number of times, and you're like, all right, okay. Another example is there's a character who anytime something really horrible is happening, and they're really anxious about it, they consistently go, oh God, oh God, oh God. And there's an acknowledgement that that's all the person is saying, that they just keep saying, oh God, oh God, oh God. And then from there on out, the rest of the book, anytime anything was happening that was frightening, which this book is just a lot of action scene, intense, and then resolution, but then now it's intense again, which means that this was happening frequently. The rest of the book, anytime something dangerous was happening, the character would go, oh God, oh God, oh God. And it would stop to remind us that this character is saying that. And I was like, okay, I actually kind of wish I'd read this digitally because I have the physical copy. And I wish I'd read it digitally because I would want to search how many times, oh God, oh God, oh God, popped up. Or just, oh God, just one time. I wanted to search how many times it was used. Because I thought, yeah, I got it. I got it. That's the thing, is so much of this book is like, I get the joke. And it reminds me of when you're at a get-together and somebody makes a joke and it kills and everybody laughs. And then the rest of the night, they keep saying that same thing again. And you're like, oh, ha, ha. It's funny at first when they say it again because it's revisiting the joke. And then they keep doing it at some point, you're like, yeah, these are pity laughs. I'm just trying to be polite, but it was funny before. It's not funny anymore. It was frequent with the, look, I'm being self-aware, and being self-aware equals funny. But it's like, no, not always. There also was just the pure frequency of jokes. It was all the time. And it was all the time in the action scenes as well. I don't mind, because clearly I don't think Abercrombie was worried or concerned about making you feel like you're on the edge of your seat, worried about these characters you've fallen in love with. I don't think that was the goal necessarily, the way that that's the case for some action scenes. Because a lot of times, as bookworms or just people that enjoy stories, we talk about like what makes us feel engaged with an action scene, especially a written one, because you don't have the visuals and the sound and the acting. It's all in the words. So how do you accomplish stakes in an action scene? And a lot of times it's what I just described. You have to feel for the characters and genuinely be worried, things like that. I don't think that's what was happening here. I think it was just the spectacle of it all, which I think for a lot of us, sometimes it's just fun to sit back and enjoy the spectacle of it all. And it makes sense that in a story like that you would weave humor into those moments for the entertainment factor, for that to go up and feel like this good, fun, campy, ridiculous time. But the frequency, it's just so often. And sometimes when a joke doesn't really work the first time, then when you keep making it, you're like, okay, it was like maybe kind of funny the first time, but then I didn't really find it funny. So then now it's just, you're saying it a lot. And this particular joke, there's a part where the characters are on a ship and their ship is being shot at. And the one character is really frightened. And one of the others says, "Don't worry, it was just a warning shot." And the scared one says, "What if it had hit me?" And they say, "Then, ... I guess, ... it'd just be a shot." I mean, I get the joke, and it's like, it's kind of funny, that's fine. But then over the course of these 2 pages, we kind of revisit that same joke, which, by the way, right here on this page, we have the character Alex going, "Oh God." So that's already there. That's not even the point. I was trying to not revisit that again, but it's there. But on that next page, it says, "Another great bolt whizzed past maybe 40 strides away, but Brother Diaz still found himself ducking. A second warning shot, perhaps. He wondered if he could possibly have felt more warned than he already did, or that he did already." And, that's what I mean by, you're like, well, it was fine the first time. And I don't need it more for everything. And another example is there's a character who ends up shoving a dagger up this they're kind of like chimera. Some of the enemies are these hybrid animal people. And so there's this crab man, and she shoves a dagger up its butt. And so there's a whole, they keep addressing like, well, I would think if you shoved it up his butt that he wouldn't be able to get to you much anymore. And we kind of just keep talking about having shoved a dagger up this thing's butt and how it's like juices were falling out. And later in the book, way later, basically the end of the book, they're talking about paintings with demons and how there's always butt stuff going on in those paintings. And I'm like, yeah, butts. I get butts can be kind of funny. And also, again, like the shock value of stabbing this thing up the butt. There's a lot of like, did you know that people have bodily functions and they have holes in their bodies too? Did you know that? Because I'm going to talk about it. So an example of we're talking about the fact that people have privates. Isn't that funny? And what if we like said certain words that are funny that are associated with privates a lot? I actually sent my friend a message kind of going over this because they're buddy reading this book with their friend, and I asked them if their friend likes a word. I won't say the word, but I'll say it kind of sounds like Twix. And I asked, does your friend really like this word? Because if so, this is the book for them. A different example of this is that within this same action scene where they're kind of running from these crabmen, they also debate in this story. This felt very like Marvel quippiness, where there's a character where they're saying, "Oh, the crab man," and the one's like, "To be fair, that one looks more like a lobster." And they're like, "I don't really feel like debating whether it's a lobster or a crab." Back to the idea of like, did you know people have privates? So this passage says, "Oh, he had strange little hairy legs sticking up from his stomach. She really didn't want to use the word underparts," which is italicized, "about anything right in front of her face. But what else could you call them? All wriggling and squiggling. So she had to squeeze her eyes and her mouth tight shut as he clambered past. Did he drip on her a bit? Did she have crab juice on her? Crab juice," also italicized, "was almost as bad as underparts," which is italicized again. On the very next page is when they keep talking about shoving a knife up something's butt. Again, this is all one action scene. I kind of wanted to use that one action scene as an example because it speaks to basically what every action scene feels like, and also I think it articulates pretty well what the whole book feels like. There is a character, back to the idea of repetition and it being like kind of at some point they'll like, I get the joke, is there's a character who's very pompous and thinks very highly of themselves, and they're a magician, and they always want to introduce themselves as this extravagant person. And so people all the time, not on purpose, they just don't know, they'll be like, "You're a sorcerer, right?" And they'll be like, "I'm a magician, dang it." And they continuously, it's that joke the whole book. And then finally one person calls them a magician. They're like, "I can't even enjoy being called a magician right now because I have to pretend I'm not who I am." There's kind of that vibe. And again, the same as at the end of the book, there's the villain monologue. So the character is like, yeah, I've heard it all at this point. You're like, no, okay, so self-awareness at the end. But it happened so many times before that it's like, I kind of needed this earlier. I needed the criticism of the jokes being made earlier, and then for new material to enter the picture. I kind of needed the new material. It was the same thing over and over again. Moving outside of humor, I also want to say this book was very predictable and fairly unoriginal. The idea of there being this ragtag group of people that join forces to go on this kind of quest, and they are snippy with each other, and there is a lot of shock value to it, because there's the hero's journey, which is all inspiring, and then there's something like this where it's kind of a subversion of expectations, where instead of everybody banding together to accomplish good, they all are terrible people, and you find yourself kind of rooting for them, but they're at each other's throats all the time too. And that's been done before, so it's not like this is the first example of that. And it doesn't need to be. Things don't need to be wholly original to be good or have value, but we have seen things like this before. And I was hoping, because I think something that Abercrombie has established himself really well in doing is that even if the subversion of the trope then makes certain things feel like, okay, so this is going to turn out bleak, or this is not going to go the way you want, there is this expectation of everything's going to go horribly wrong, because of course it is. In this story, everything was really predictable, which was surprising to me, because there are reveals and twists and turns throughout the story. And from the very beginning, I don't want to reveal these twists and turns because, of course, I don't want to ruin your reading experience if you pick this up. But pretty much as soon as something entered the picture, I thought, well, that's obviously going to be the thing that... And I'm kind of looking around at the characters in the story thinking, how are none of you thinking that this is what's actually going down? And then when it was happening, I was like, well, yeah, I mean... It was so obvious. I do think there are times where authors can essentially lull you into a false sense of comfort, and then it makes the reveal or the twist, whatever it may be, it can make that really shock you, because you actually start to think this is a one-trick pony, and you almost... I don't want to go as far as to say you lose respect for the story or anything like that, but you just haven't been surprised for so long that when the surprise happens, you realize it was intentional to make you feel like there's no way that something could take me aback. And I actually feel like Abercrombie accomplishes that pretty well in his other works, and in this, I kept waiting. I kept thinking, all right, I'm really not enjoying a lot of this story. I'm not really enjoying I think the action scenes feel really similar from one to the next. I have gone on and on and on about the humor, so we won't touch on that. But I was like, but I feel like there's a point. I feel like we're going to get to the end, and then suddenly there's going to be something that occurs that really takes me aback, because I have my suspicions, but there's no way it's actually going to be my suspicions. There's no way. And then when it was, I thought, I read all of that for the thing I predicted at the pretty much opening scene. Predictability, of course, is a very difficult thing to touch on because of the fact that not everybody ends up having things be predictable, and people go into stories differently. So for some people, when they jump into a story, they actively try not to see what's going to happen next or theorize as they're reading, because they want to just be along for the ride. And that is such a fun way to go into a story. And certainly there are times where I feel like that's what I want to do as well. But in this story, the reason that I really didn't find that was my tendency is because I kept thinking, well, surely there's a reason that we're being so repetitive, and I'm sure it will be because the reveals that we get in the story are going to shock me, and I'll never have seen them coming. So when I did see them coming, I was like, oh, I mean, I have a hard time even justifying the repetitive nature of the rest of the story, because it's a familiar framework we're building upon. It is extremely repetitive. I do think that while, yes, humor is subjective, we've already gone in depth about how I still feel like there's skill, and for me, this was not an example of humor done really, really well. And then predictability. So it made it so that I do think there are a lot of things that we're trying to be critical of, and we're using a really fun, action-packed, funny story to do that. But it ended up not really delivering on any of the points that I was hoping it would. based off of the expectations I had as I was reading it. And as such, this ended up really not working for me. I won't be continuing with the series because of the fact that I, from my personal tastes, don't find particularly strong redeeming qualities in this work. However, this is going to be such a fun, wild, crazy time for a lot of readers. And I think some people are craving that. We have a lot of fantasy that is really, really huge in the world building and the magic. And then we have a lot of stories that are really about character interactions and relationship building. And then we have stories that are talking about important things, but they're doing it through such a strong, bleak, depressing lens that sometimes you just need the fun, action-packed, over-the-top story. And I think there's certainly a place for it. For me, this was not the best example of that kind of story, but it is certainly going to work for a lot of people. The last thing I want to touch on is that if this is your first experience with Abercrombie and you did not like this book, I would say there is still a chance that you will like his other works. However, I would recommend taking a break because I feel like the humor in the rest of his works is still falling into under a similar umbrella and a similar style. It's just this was turned all the way up, whereas in the other one it's used more, it feels strategically. And thus, I do think it results in things, you almost sometimes don't even know when there's a joke happening because it's very cheeky and subtle. And sometimes it's up front, and the contrast between sneaky, subtle, and really smart versus when it's just so dumb, I think that balance is very different than what you get in the Devils. So there's a chance that you will like the others, but you might want to maybe have a pause if you're willing to try the other works. Wait a little bit so you don't feel like you're fatigued of the style of humor. And if you're somebody who loved the Devils, there is still a chance that you'll like the others, of course, because there are plenty of people that like both of the works. But I could see this being divisive among Abercrombie fans because it is very different from the other works. And I actually really love when authors take chances to go outside their wheelhouse. I don't think there's anything wrong with authors who have a very distinct authorial voice and that every time you go into their works, I know what I'm getting into, and that's comforting and exciting because it brings you enjoyment. That is completely fine. I think it's risky for authors to take chances, but I always appreciate when they do. I feel like an author who has done this before is somebody like Naomi Novik, because Spinning Silver is so different from Temporary. And I think it's really cool when you pick something up and you think, this is the same author. There are still, of course, things that are clearly indicating this is Abercrombie, but there's still so many distinctions between this and his other works that I think it was very bold of him to go in this direction. This is going to work for a lot of people, obviously, because we've had an announcement it's going to be adapted. I think there are going to be a lot of people who end up coming to this story through the future adaptation, and they're going to really like that edgy, fun, action-packed style. So it didn't work for me at all, but I still think that this is valuable and that there are a lot of people that are going to enjoy this. If you felt completely different from me and you want to elaborate as to why, feel free, of course, to do that. If you felt similarly, feel free to say. And if you're somewhere in the middle, then I would love to know your thoughts. Are you kind of pulled in both directions? You see both sides? I just, in general, I am glad that I decided to do a whole thing dedicated to this and kind of a progression of my thoughts, because I don't know that a simple talking about this in a new fantasy releases wrap-up would have allowed for the opportunity to go as in-depth about it as I really would have wanted. But anyway, would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching. If you are interested in checking this book out, I'll have it linked in the description bar. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.